Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 18 of our summit, Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May for 2 hours between 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock p.m. Central European Time, we have been broadcasting live on a range of platforms on Awake TV to 10 to 15, sometimes 20,000 people a day, as we all navigate through the pandemic. This is an unprecedented moment in human affairs. For the first time, virtually everyone, everywhere, is undergoing the same experience. And that has put the world in the same conversation. We're experiencing the same emotions of anxiety and fear about our future. There's confusion and bewilderment as to how we navigate through what's coming. What kind of world are we going to experience on the other side? So we at Ubiquity University thought that the way we could contribute to some kind of positive solution is simply to create a global commons, so that people from all over the world could come together and not only share what they're experiencing, but to take counsel together as to how we can enhance our strategic effectiveness and actually make a difference in the post-pandemic world. What are our positive visions? And how can we transform our visions and our conversations into actions that really make a difference? It's on that anvil that Humanity Rising is being hammered into being. We started with the first 10 days just listening to women's voices in the conviction that it is going to take the radical empowerment of women as a national security issue into executive leadership for the world to get to where it needs to go. Just imagine if every country and every organization in the world between now and 2030 were headed by women. And not only women, but young women. I would bet a lot of money that the world would get to where we all know we need to get to by 2030 if we would simply empower women and youth. So that's how we started Humanity Rising. 10 days of women's voices and 7 days of youth voices. And now today, we're taking a pause. We want to just stop and reflect. And we want to do it in two ways. First, I want to introduce an amazing poet. And then we're going to have a dialogue with one of the leading, I would say, contemporary public intellectuals of our time, Charles Eisenstein. But let us start with the arts. Let us start with poetic discourse after 17 days of prose, where we've done a lot of talking together. So I'd like to introduce Kim Rosen. She and I have known each other for many years. I've seen her perform her poetry. She's written an extraordinary book called Saved by a Poem, and she very kindly offered to give us a few minutes at the beginning and then at the end of today's session of her poetry. Kim, a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's such an honor to be with you and with all of you at this extraordinary moment in history. What a gift. And also to be a part of the conversation between Jim and Charles, which I feel is going to be a pivotal conversation at this moment in history. Um, I loved your introduction, Jim, and I want to underline the poet W.S. Merwin says that poetry arises from the unknown and it leads us into the unknown. So, to me, another way of saying that is that poetry uses the mind to unlock the mind so that another level of wisdom can come through the open doors. Today, I'm going to speak 3 poems here at the beginning, and I'm going to tell you their names now. The first one, they're not poems that I wrote, they're poems that I am a devotee of and that have opened my life and I hope will touch yours as well. The first one is a poem called Threshold. It's a poem that I love, and it will be spoken to a piece of music by Helen Jane Long called Aviators. The second poem is a poem called Thank You by W.S. Merwin, who I just quoted. And the third is a poem by Dina Metzger called Song. So that's Threshold by Newton Smith, Thanks by W.S. Merwin, and Song by Dina Metzger. To 2 pieces of music, Aviators by Helen Jane Long and Reach In by Jamie Sieber and Agu. It has happened. You thought you had some control of your life and that you were in a place you understood, in a time that moved from a past you knew to a future that followed in a more or less straight line. But here you are at the edge of a shore, the shallow waves washing over your feet and taking the sand you stand on away, and suddenly you wonder if all the ground beneath you is disappearing. You have crossed through the threshold. You are on the other side. The door has closed and locked behind you. You try to forget it, distract yourself, but nothing works. You check your messages. The doctor's office has left a number on your phone. Is it a blood test result? Survival rate for treatment? Or days left to live? Now you are alone. As the panic subsides, you stand there looking around. Everything is fresh. Colors are vivid. Your hearing is sharp. You can smell scents, even subtle ones. You feel the breeze on your skin and the tickle of hairs moving across your brow. You are pierced through with the singular joy at having nothing. Everywhere you turn, there is something new, and the air around you holds you gently as it spills out into the expanding world. So many things are remarkable now. Here is the freedom that always terrified you. You have forgotten your name. You have forgotten your name, and it does not matter. Listen. With night falling, we are saying, thank you. We are stopping on the bridges to bow from the railings. We are standing by the water, thanking it. Smiling by the windows, looking out in our directions. Back from a series of hospitals. Back from a mugging. We are saying thank you. After funerals, after news of the dead, whether or not we knew them, we are saying thank you. Over telephones and in the backs of cars and in doorways. Remembering wars and the police at the door and the beatings. On the stairs, we are saying thank you. In the banks, we are saying thank you. In the faces of the officials and of the rich and of all who will never change, we go on saying thank you. Thank you. With the animals dying around us, our lost feelings, we are saying thank you. With the forests falling faster than the minutes of our lives, we are saying thank you. With the words going out like the cells of a brain, with the cities growing over us, we are saying thank you. With nobody listening, we are saying thank you. We are saying thank you faster and faster and waving. Dark though it is. With the animals dying around us, our lost feelings, we are saying thank you. With the forests falling faster than the minutes of our lives, with the words going out like the cells of a brain, with the cities growing over us, we are saying thank you. We are saying thank you faster and faster. We are saying thank you and waving. Dark though it is. There are those who are trying to set fire to the world. We are in danger. There is time only to work slowly. There is no time not to love. poem called Threshold by Newton Smith, a poem called Thanks by W.S. Merwin, a poem called Song by Dina Metzger, music by Helen Jane Long, Jamie Sieber, and Agu. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. You know, it's an extraordinary thing about words. There's a vast distance between prose and poetry. I think Kim, in just a few minutes, summarized our journey so far. And in your opening words, Kim, I think you've summarized the current world situation in relationship to the pandemic. We thought we were in control. We thought we were in control. So thank you. And Kim will be back toward the end of the session. I'd like to now introduce Charles Eisenstein. He has written a number of books that many of you will know: Sacred Economics, The Ascent of Humanity, and a number of others. He has been a public commentator on a range of issues. He's written on the history of civilization, on economics, on spirituality, on the environment, on climate change. He received a lot of attention several months ago when he wrote an op-ed called The Coronation, which managed in just a few words to capture the zeitgeist at that moment. As we were all entering the pandemic, no one was quite sure what to make of it. We knew it was serious, but we weren't sure how to think about it. And Charles was one of the first people that thought the pandemic for us in a way that really empowered many people. So Charles, I want to thank you for coming. I actually had invited Charles to be part of the opening session on the 22nd. Then I thought, you can't do Charles in 20 minutes. He needs a much longer, deeper time. And so I asked if he would be willing to be the first dialogue that we're going to have, which we'll have periodically through Humanity Rising. But just as a moment, as I said in the opening, where we just step back and we pause to go deeper into the truth of what is bearing down upon us all. So Charles, I'd like to start actually with you, just letting people know a little bit more about yourself, anything you want to bring to bear about your background, maybe an event or two in your past that really opened you up to the gravity of the current world situation, that activated your extraordinary mind to think deeply on these things. Before we jump into the coronation and other weighty matters of the moment, just provide some texture about what led you to the present moment.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm very happy to be here with you, and thank you for your kind words. Right now, I am not in my usual studio. I'm in fact at my brother's farm in Pennsylvania, so there might be certain distractions, children, roosters, conversations going on in the farmhouse here. Yeah, I was, you know, the thing where your grandparents didn't finish high school, but then your parents did, and they maybe went to college, and then the next generation gets a PhD. Well, in my family, both my parents have PhDs or, high degrees. I mean, that's how it was. Their parents maybe got a little college and go back another one or two generations and they were illiterate. So but I have just a BA, a bachelor's degree, and I've got a 24-year-old and a 21-year-old now who have neither of them gone to college. And my 24-year-old, we were just having a conversation about it. And, he has this idea that he probably should, it's not coming from me, but he's just more excited about this permaculture opportunity where they've persuaded the borough of Lancaster to give them 10 years on some riparian land that's being degraded, and they can, form a plan to restore that land. And his priorities are no longer defined by the system that I grew up in. And I've been, I don't know if I'm like ruining his life by imparting my rebellious defiance to him. But to answer your question, I guess I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I had in my life a number of experiences that confirmed a secret suspicion that I had, that I wasn't being told all of what's real, and that this line that the poem spoke of, from past to a glorious future, was leading us toward a mirage that is always on the horizon. And the fixation on that mirage prevents us from going to the many beautiful places that we could otherwise visit if our eyes were in reality. And that reality encompasses so much more than what our education, our politics, our religion, or even our science is telling us. And that any meaningful social or political or economic change, any change in our relationship to this planet, has to take into account these far-flung threads of the tapestry of reality that have been discarded by civilization. Now, I could go into like some of what these specific experiences were, but then people will probably be like, okay, this guy's a kook, he believes in whatever. So I'll pause for the moment there. But I bet a lot of you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, it's so universal, really, this gnawing sense that the conventional reality as we know it isn't quite what it seems, and that there's more going on. I mean, that's Plato's allegory of the cave, right? And so thank you for sharing it, because I think all of us at some point wake up, some more than others, and you clearly have to a significant degree. Let's talk, Charles, more about the Coronation that you wrote some months ago now. I was struck by it because very early in the piece, you said that the pandemic was a rehab intervention to break our addictive hold on normalcy. And I thought, what an extraordinary way to understand what's happening. And I think those were prescient words, because that's exactly what's happened. And so I think my question is twofold. One, a couple months later, as you look back on that original piece written early in the pandemic, what aspects do you think were more true than you imagined then? And what aspects did not turn out to be as relevant as you thought they might be? In other words, how would you revise the Coronation in light of what's happened up to the present day? And then secondly, I'd love your comment on your central theme of the Coronation as a potential coronation, the corona,
Yeah.
the crown. Let's start there.
Yeah. So when I wrote it, I was okay. Before I wrote it, when I first started seeing it coming up in the news, I'm like, oh boy, this looks like a hysteria if I've ever seen one. And then uh, I was holding a retreat actually out west, and I got home kind of just in time, and I dove deep into researching this phenomenon. And I was initially, and some of this is in the essay, I was like, this is tailor made for our society and our political classes to act from what is familiar to them as action. Because of all of our problems, finally, here's one that can be blamed on a pathogen, which is not true for most of our other problems, like depression, or environmental collapse, or the carceral state, or income inequality. I mean, we try to blame those on a bad guy. We try to blame income inequality on the rich. We try to blame crime on the criminals. We try to blame climate change on or ecological collapse on carbon dioxide or on oil companies. We try to find a thing to fight. But most of our problems today do not succumb to that mentality. When one comes along, and this is what I said in the essay, then we're like, great, now we know what to do. Now we know how to solve our problems. Find something to kill. That's what civilization is good at. Find something to control, find something to dominate. This is the patriarchal, world dominating stance for problem solving. So I'm like, okay, whatever the real risk of this virus, it is definitely going to be amplified because it fits so well into the mentality of control and the systems of control that we have as a society. And that turned out to be true. Um, However, in those days, I was like, I have friends who are doctors, who are even like trained doctors and who are, connected to like many, many physicians working in the so-called front lines. And I was hearing like, wow, our hospitals are being overwhelmed. Like this doctor is saying his hospital's being overwhelmed. This doctor's saying there's a totally new illness, So I'm like, I don't want to be so fixated on my um, initial prejudice that I am keeping out other data points. So a big aspect of the essay was, I don't know. Let's take in all of the data points, whether we agree with them or not, whether they serve us politically or not, whether they fit into our existing paradigm of illness and health or not. Take them all in. And that was, so when I wrote it, I actually, I think I erred on the side of portraying it as more serious than it actually was, even though I was, I received criticism for portraying it as less serious than people thought it was. I mean, back when I wrote it, the WHO was saying it has a 3.4% fatality rate. And if you said that it was on the order of the flu or maybe a little bit more, you were ridiculed. And, but now it turns out that those critics were actually close to the mark. So, but maybe that's, I don't know. One thing I said in the essay is that however it plays out, no one is ever going to admit that they were wrong because you can interpret the data to fit whatever narrative you hold. So was it actually less dangerous than we were told, or is it that lockdown worked? Each position can elaborate their story based on the evidence and can screen out evidence that they don't like. And so the whole thing demonstrates how powerful our stories are in creating the reality that we experience, which isn't, now when I say that, some people are like, oh, okay, New Ager thinks that beliefs create reality. What I'm saying though is that beliefs, stories, agreements, narratives, and reality bear an intimate and mysterious co-creative connection. We create reality and reality creates us. It's a relationship. And that that truth of being, that to exist is to be in relationship. in relationship to the world, in relationship to each other, in relationship to the bacterial realm, to the microbial realm. That now is coming up even more strongly with the current civil unrest and the heightened perception of the heightened visibility, let me say, of racial injustice, especially in this country. The felt sense of connection that we call empathy is rising right now in one after another realm. Yeah, and I guess this is to answer your second question. And this isn't the first, like this is one of a series of teachings that humanity, or maybe we should say civilized, quote unquote, humanity is receiving about the nature of reality, which is that we are not separate. So the first teaching was maybe the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons, which showed us that what we do to the other, actually we're going to do to ourselves. And total war became a relic of the past. There has been no total war since 1945. The second is the ecological crisis. What we do to nature comes back to us in some form. If we destroy the rainforests, maybe we destroy ourselves. Or really, but that's actually suggesting a deeper truth, which is not necessarily that we don't survive when we destroy the rainforests, but it's that something in us dies. And we can feel, let me know if I'm going on too long here and meandering too much. Okay. We can feel that death actually in any cutoff of our full set of relationships. So if you are living in a place where you are cut off from community and cut off from nature and bereft of these close relationships to the other beings that are actually part of ourself, then you're going to feel less than fully alive, less than fully human, because you are not in a wholeness. You're in a narrow, separate self. So anyway, yeah. So this death that happens within ourselves when any other species or ecosystem or being is not themselves fully alive. This consciousness is rising in many, many areas. And then comes COVID-19, where no longer could we think that my health is independent or separate from the health of everybody else. It was conveying that truth to us. Now, in fact, again, I would say that the disease was not as, I mean, certainly it was a serious disease and a lot of people died. But as far as like a terrifying killer compared to, say, the bubonic plague, no. Actually, in actual fact, I tend to agree with the authorities who have been somewhat marginalized, who are saying that the masks, the distancing, the quarantine actually weren't even the right approach. Be that as it may, it was still communicating an essential truth to us, that we're all in this together, that you cannot actually be healthy if you are laying waste to the world, if other people are not healthy. You cannot actually be rich if there is poverty elsewhere in the world. You cannot be free if other people are enslaved. You cannot flourish when others are in poverty, because you have to always guard against the other. That's not wealth. Wealth is not to effectively protect yourself and keep as much as possible and be at constant war with those who are deprived. Wealth is that you feel at home in the world. Wealth is that you have a feeling of belonging, abundance. You feel free to be generous. You know that you're going to be taken care of without being at war against the world. That's wealth. So I think that the outrage, I haven't gone into Coronation yet, but I will now. I'll just say, I was going to go to George Floyd, but let me just say then that these initiations that humanity has been receiving, nuclear war, ecological collapse, pandemic, are delivering to us this fundamental truth of how actually to be wealthy, to be sovereign, to be free through understanding our interconnection. When we have that full set of data, then we can consciously choose a future. So I'll pause right now because my dear mother has walked into the room.
She's welcome.
Yeah. Hi, Mom.
You're done?
No, I'm in the middle of it.
I just need a paper clip.
Ah, okay. Where are they? In here?
Yeah. Oh,
Oh, here we are.
ah,
No, that's a safety pin.
yeah, okay, there's paper clips in here.
This is life in a lockdown, everyone. We're all in our homes and life continues all around us. That was beautiful. Thank you. Charles, I'd like to delve into the killing of George Floyd. It was striking to me that of any event that's happened over the last several months since the pandemic began, it was the killing of a Black man in Minneapolis about 2 weeks ago that somehow ignited the most extraordinary global, almost a spasm of protest and activism in the face of coordinated, highly militarized police reaction. And I want to tease this out at a couple levels. One of the things that struck me in the midst of a pandemic that had many respiratory elements, and people were given respirators because people couldn't breathe. People have had to put face masks on, which makes it hard to breathe. George Floyd, for 9 minutes before he was finally killed, was saying, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." And in one of the protests in Seattle a couple of days ago, they projected onto one of the buildings in downtown, "We can't breathe." And I'd love your comment on the relationship, if any, that you see between this extraordinary act of racism and a pandemic, and how that event would go viral, global, when the pandemic was around health, but it was actually an event on racial injustice in America that ignited the global protest in the midst of this pandemic. How do you understand that? What's your perception?
Yeah. So let me say I don't fully understand it. I'm taking my time to write about this and gathering information, standing in different perspectives to try to understand it from multiple perspectives. So whatever I say is I'm kind of thinking out loud a little bit.
Sure.
So here again, okay, so the one thing that's really significant is that this incident, this murder, would not have 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, would not have generated the response that it has today. Now, on the one hand, that's simply because of technology, because it was, filmed with cell phone cameras. and spread virally. But it's also because it's no longer acceptable. Like in the 40s and 50s, there were plenty of lynchings of Black people in the southern United States. And, you know, it was not a matter of mass popular outrage. People knew about it, or they pretended not to know about it, but it wasn't so not okay that people would flood the streets and say this cannot go on. Just to go out there without even demands, but just to say this is intolerable. So what was once tolerable to the public mind has become intolerable. And that's really heartening, because it says to me, if we no longer tolerate this, what are all the other horrors happening on this planet that we will no longer tolerate? It is no longer acceptable for someone to be murdered on account of their race. So that's one level. Another level is that, so just as with COVID-19, a virus became the receptacle of many, many latent inchoate fears, and a convenient receptacle, because now we have something to, as I said before, we have something to fight against. We have something to dominate. We have something that admits of a solution that we know how to pursue. There was a comfort in that. In the same way, we look toward racism as the culprit. And maybe that racism is caused by what? Caused by racists. So here again, there's something to fight, a single cause for something that has brought itself to our attention. But I'm afraid that the problem is a lot deeper than simple racism, or a lot deeper than racists. Just as patriarchy, as you mentioned at the beginning, cannot be overcome simply by installing women in positions now occupied by men. It's a lot deeper than that. So yeah, we have a racism problem in this country. I looked at some statistics, something like over 1,000 people a year are killed by police. And I think it was like 400 of them are Black, which is way out of proportion to the number of Black people in the population. So that is a fact. And pretty much every Black person I've ever met has encountered blatant racism of one sort or another. And at the same time, we also have not just a racial problem, but a problem of violence and police brutality. Because think about the 600 whatever white people who are killed by police every year. Do you know what the figure is for England? How many people are killed in England every year by police? It's three, not 300, 3. And for the Netherlands, it's like 1. Switzerland, none. I mean, there's a problem here that cannot be reduced just to one thing. So I appreciate the proposals going around now, like that, hey, maybe we should totally disband the police force. Maybe we should rethink policing from the ground up. Because ultimately, police violence comes, I don't want to reduce it to one cause, but one of the causes is the idea of the bad guy, the paradigm of punishment, of justice equaling punishment. Imagine like you go through police training, and you've been watching police movies your whole life, and you've been acculturated in 1,000 ways to see a world of good people and bad people. And you know what the depictions of criminals are like in most movies. They are like these inscrutably evil people. Like there's no reason. They're just bad. They're dangerous. And there you are out on the streets, driving in your police cruiser, and you've got a gun, and here's like a guy, he might be one of those. scary guys who in the films were often depicted as Black people. Not to mention, and see, here's how you can have racism without even having to have racists. If you have a system that has legacy racism, in which Black and brown people are poorer, they're impoverished, they don't have economic opportunities, they have a legacy of trauma that's passed on genetically. And in a lot of places in this country, the only economic opportunity, I mean, there's some exceptions, but to make an exaggeration, is the illegal drug trade or the military. Like there's almost no other way to really advance yourself in the world. So of course you're going to have higher, quote, crime rates when you have a system that necessitates crime. So that's why that's one reason, at least, why there's such an association with race, race and poverty. So these problems cannot be solved by finding a bad thing and dominating it. They cannot be solved by plucking out all of the racists within police departments, because it is imbued into the whole conception of what policing is, to crack down on the criminals who are found among the poor people, who are poor because of this vast system of capitalism, patriarchy, racism, and so forth that goes back hundreds or even thousands of years. Like you cannot just solve that by destroying something. In fact, that whole mentality is itself part of the problem. So this is why I always want to invite a bigger frame to the conversation, which isn't to say don't express your rage, but be careful, because the powers that be, and I'm not necessarily talking about evil humans in power, but power itself that makes puppets of humans. So let me just say that the powers that be, they sustain themselves by diverting the rage onto false targets so that it never sinks down, and so that energy never can be used to overturn the whole system.
Well, let's jump in here with what I think is the other side of the George Floyd coin. On the one hand, you have a racial killing in its most simple form. And the other side of that coin is the police response to the protests. And in this regard, Charles, I was very struck by Yuval Harari's op-ed in the Financial Times a little before your coronation, where he said, this pandemic in the end is not going to be about our health. We're going to solve that part because science is going to come up with some solutions. He says the deeper issue and the real threat that the pandemic poses is to democracy itself, and how the powers that be, as you just called them, will be using the pandemic in a way to increase surveillance, in a way to further erode privacy, in a way that, as we saw in hundreds of locations around the United States and even parts of the world, the police are getting more and more heavily militarized. The brutality is becoming more severe. So from, again, 10,000 feet, what's your view of the relationship between pandemic and our democratic institutions?
Yeah, I mean, this was another big part of the essay that I wrote as well. And I read Yuval's piece shortly after mine came out. Yeah, that because, I also, like, in my gathering of data points, I went as far afield as David Icke, and the outright conspiracy theorists. And I'm like, yeah, it sure can look like a conspiracy because this is playing perfectly into the totalitarian wish list. It's checking every box of totalitarianism. Okay, we have to track everybody now. We have to get permission from the authorities to be at any particular location. And what I said is that this doesn't have to be from a conspiracy. It could also come from a civilizational tilt toward control, where progress for centuries, for thousands of years even, has meant progress in our ability to control nature and to control human beings, to domesticate the wild, to civilize the barbarians, to control the body with the mind. All of these are part of the same program. And if you accept that precept, that progress means progress in our ability to control things, then all of these measures seem totally justified. They seem, yeah, of course, because we're going to use it for the good. We're not tracking people to control them in an Orwellian state. It's to keep them safe. Safety itself is a form of control, actually. It's a value that I argued in the essay needs to stand alongside other values and not to be the highest value. Like, what about the value of touch, of festivals, of concerts, of parties, of weddings, of funerals, of children wrestling and playing with each other, of hugs? Like, what about the value of those? Should we live forevermore without those in order to be safer? And that is not a black and white question. It's how much safer. So anyway, so the suspension of civil liberties was, to me, a symptom of a deeper tendency that is actually the same tendency as the regime of control that is translated into modern medicine, where we understand viruses and bacteria as predators, essentially, that victimize you if you're not strong enough, rather than looking at them through bioterrain theory, which is maybe that they're a symptom of a diseased tissue. Maybe racists are the same, symptom of a diseased tissue, and not the cause, but part of a complex. So this way of thinking, which you could call holistic, I think that's what is invited of us today, as we play this whack-a-mole game of it's this, no, it's that, no, it's that. Like, what's the problem? It isn't a thing that's the problem, and we can keep everything else intact. It's in everything. So now I kind of lost track of your original. Yeah, I think
No.
I think I said it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's good, that the system, like the body, is one system. And we talk about the endocrine system or the digestive system or the neural system, but the body doesn't know that. That is the way we are parsing a complex system so that we can understand the parts, because it's hard for us to hold the whole. And I really want to affirm the point that you're making. The connection between a pandemic and the killing of George Floyd and police surveillance and various other factors is not apparent, but it's real. And our challenge is really to hold the whole and hold the complexity as it's unfolding, without running after quick and easy solutions. I completely agree with that.
Because I don't even think that this is working for the police. In fact, I know that my neighbor back home is a cop. I'm sure he's not interested in oppressing people. A lot of now there are some cops who are basically psychopaths, and they can get away with a lot in the kind of system we have today. but most cops don't want to be enemies of the people. Most cops are not racists. You know, they don't want to be dressed in masks and be beating people with clubs. So if we want to actually solve this problem, ultimately, instead of just directing our rage at a convenient bad guy, but we want this to actually change, then we can't take the bait of hating the most convenient enemy that is offered to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's turn to another highly paradoxical aspect of the pandemic, and that is social distancing. It's quite an extraordinary thing if you think about it, that when humanity went through its first global event, it wasn't some big celebration. It was to endure an epidemic of diseases brought down by our own hands. And that in response to it, we all decided we needed to stay at least 1.5 meters away from each other for a significantly long period of time. And, I wanted you to comment on that because your writings in Sacred Economics and in some of your interviews, you speak at some length about the fact that we are relationship. That's what we are. We're in an ecology of relatedness where there's no end and no beginning of anything. It's just a seamless web of life.
Yeah.
Yet here we are. And, if the pandemic was an intervention to break up the addiction of normalcy, in some ways, the pandemic was Mother Nature sending us all to our rooms at a critical moment when we've been engaging in very bad behavior and telling us to think about things for a while.
Yeah, I've heard that metaphor.
Until we can figure out a better way of being in the world. So this, within the context of unified field, in every country afflicted by the pandemic, we're engaging in social isolation. Comment on that. How would you advise people to navigate through that contradiction?
Well, one way I see it is that we're being shown in stark colors the direction that we've already been going for a long time. Social distancing has just taken on an extreme form during the pandemic, but it's not new. The breakdown of community, the disappearance of public space, the migration of life indoors, the migration of life online, the breakup of the extended family, the disconnection from place, the reliance on things delivered from far away rather than things made by people who are connected to you in other ways. Like all of these are longstanding trends that I wrote about in Ascent of Humanity, actually, almost 20 years ago now. And I'm not the only one who's written about those kind of things. So the pandemic showed us where we have been headed, to a world of separation. In the Ascent of Humanity, I wrote about I called it the story of separation, the program of control, and the paradise that it offered, which was that someday we will be in complete control of the world, so that the discrete, separate self is safe from anything that could happen to it and can imprint its intelligence onto a world that fundamentally has none of its own. That was the mythology that I described. And I said, it's generating endless crisis that will eventually birth us into an age of reunion, a coming back together again. But that maybe it has to reach its extreme. So maybe this is the extreme where we say, is this really where we go? Because a lot of things in life, you only realize how precious they are when you've lost them. And we kind of took them for granted. So this was an aspect of the coronation. Now this mindless direction that we've been going in toward like distancing, I mean, it's kind of like quarantine, kind of like lockdown, education moving online. Like so many of the ways that people interacted in person have been shriveling up anyway. And so we're asked now, this, and it seemed like kind of inevitable and just the future and just the way things are going. And now, because we've been shown it, we can make a conscious choice. Do we want to keep going in that direction? That is another aspect of sovereignty, or the coronation, where we consciously choose what had helplessly enthralled us before. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm constantly saying, let's question this conception of progress, where Fauci said we should maybe never shake hands again, or where it becomes normalized to never see a full human face in person. Like, what's that like for a baby? Babies from before humans even had language have developed neurologically through seeing faces, not just a few faces, but many faces. Like that's part of being human. That's a communication system that is literally older than words, the reading of expressions. My wife was shopping the other day, and there was like this really cute baby, and she goes up and she goes, "Ooh, cutie, cutie, cutie," and making a funny face. But because the baby could, basically what the baby saw was this person coming up with a mask, and the baby started crying. And I'm like, and reading some of the CDC guidelines for reopening schools, like children must be 6 feet apart, all facing the same direction, like, my God, school was tyrannical enough already. Like,
Yeah.
what are they going to have to do to make the kids, no more gym, no more assembly, no more cafeteria, prepackaged food only, no sharing food, like all the stuff that was fun is to be abolished. And I'm like, yeah, how many steps are we willing to take toward this paradise of perfect control, which actually, not only is it not a paradise, but it doesn't even bring the benefits of control. Like, we are not going to be healthier if we obsessively pursue distancing and hygiene all the time, because our immune systems require these challenges. We are not separate selves. We are interbeings, and we require a throughput of information and constantly maintain relationships in order to thrive, in order to be whole, which is a synonym for health, wholeness, health. So what I want to, this is what I'm holding, is that the lesson that we learn is that, wow, we really overreacted. We are seeing in front, we are being shown the direction that we've been going. We're being shown our compulsion to control and what it brings, and we don't want that anymore. Let's rethink everything. And to extend it to George Floyd and police, yeah, let's totally rethink policing. It doesn't have to be about punishment. It doesn't have to be an occupying force. There are so many in the margins that so many alternative forms of justice, like restorative circles, truth and reconciliation committees, restorative justice, transparency. This is the other thing that about the Orwellian stuff, the Yuval Harari's observation that this is moving us toward a world of constant government surveillance. There's another possibility here. Rather than surveillance, a world of transparency. Another form of justice is possible in a world of transparency. What if it's not just the government spying on us? What if we're spying on the government too? What if, as in a traditional hunter-gatherer society, what if everybody is transparent to everybody else? What if the age of secrets, which is another form of control, is on its way out too? Or we can claim a world without secrets, a world of transparency, a world of regeneration and restoration. that is the possibility that we're, I don't think we're quite there yet, but that's the possibility that is pulling us.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that raises in my mind your theory of social change. How do, in your mind, given the whole system approach of your thinking and the very careful way that you're trying to weigh different factors, how does the world move forward in your mind? Are you, as we create a more sustainable post-pandemic world, what would be your advice to activists, to people that really want to get out there and activate solutions? Um, is it direct action? Is it pressure on the government? How do you view social change under current conditions?
I think all of those things have their place, and all of them can be counterproductive if you're not aware of the origin of the things that you're trying to change. So, for example, if you are trying to stop racism, are you aware of like the deeper economic and mythological foundation of racism, which is dehumanization? The idea that some people are less fully human than others. That's what racism is. And if you do that to your opponents in the course of fighting racism, if you think that it is strategically helpful to paint them as in as ugly tones as possible, to pick out all of the bad things about their behavior and ignore all of the good things, to treat them as less than human, then you are contributing to the basic field from which racism comes. It's not that here I'm the white man scolding, say, Black people for, being resentful of powerful white people. It's not about scolding. It's about let's actually change the foundation of racism. Let's stop this cycle that we've seen throughout history of any time the oppressed rise up, they end up becoming the new oppressors. What we really want, whether we're talking about ending patriarchy or ending white supremacy, it's not a system in which some other group now exercises domination over the rest. We want to end that world of domination altogether. So my advice to activists is become aware of the unconscious stories and mythologies that run our civilization, so that as you do any kind of activist work, you are also operating on the level of story. There's a lot of ways to do direct action that don't require hating those you're trying to stop or trying to make them look bad or waging war against them. You can do things in a way that invites them in. You can use, and sometimes these things don't work. I mean, sometimes you have to run away. Sometimes you have to fight. But the reigning mythology is one in which there's no alternative but to fight. If you understand your opponents as irredeemably evil, irredeemably and irremediably evil, then change will only come through a quasi-military victory over them, because they're never going to change. If you believe that they, whoever they are never going to change, you have not created the possibility of them changing. But if you hold that possibility, you create an invitation for them to change. And we have to then recognize, like, as I said, most of the police, they don't want it to be like this. We have to recognize that the 1% even are not actually benefiting from the current system. Yeah, generally speaking, they're better off than the 99%. But as far as are they living fulfilled, joyous lives? If you want to find an actually joyous human being, you're not going to find them in the Hamptons or Beverly Hills. You're going to find them in, Peru, in the Andes, or, in a village in Bangladesh or somewhere where they might be materially very poor. But like sometimes you go to those places and you're like, oh my God, now I know what joy is.
Yeah.
This system isn't working for anybody. And therefore, as we seek to topple the system, it can be in an attitude of joyous invitation, which can coexist with the rage, with the indignation, with the pain at what you or others are experiencing. Like that energy needs to feed and energize us as well. We have to take in all of the data points, but let's not live in a universe that is fashioned only of the pain and the outrage, because you will not be effective that way. You will be operating on an incomplete data set.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be in reality. And that reality has to include the ugliest, the human trafficking, the satanic ritual abuse. Like there is a dark underbelly that we haven't even gotten to. And it also has to include the incredible miracles of forgiveness and reconciliation that, like, we have to, if we don't create an invitation for that, there's no future worth living in.
That's beautiful. It reminds me of what Alfred North Whitehead said about 100 years ago, that the complexity of the world is such that Christ is crucified and the fairies dance. And I think that's what you're saying, is that we really have to hold the whole, the dark and the light in all the shades of the rainbow, basically, which characterizes our human existence and the larger ecosystem. And that raises, to my mind, Charles, a very profound question, given the complexity that you're drawing to our attention, and given one of the realities of fake news and the fact that we actually don't know what's true anymore as it comes through social media, through the television, on the media. How do you know what you know? How does one, under current conditions, how does one get to the real?
Yeah. Boy, I wish that there was a shortcut, I wish we could say, don't trust it unless it's on an authoritative site. But the authoritative sites are themselves among the most egregious purveyors of fake news.
Totally.
Especially if that news furthers US military imperialism or neoliberal development. Or any kind of orthodoxy, like we're starting to see criticism of GMOs, that's, being fake news, or criticism of, I won't even say it because then you'll get banned from YouTube, criticism of X, Y, or Z. Like anything that seems like more and more what gets branded as fake news is anything that damages the interests of the corporate political complex. And of course, then there's all the fake news coming from outside the mainstream. And I'm thinking, like, what motivates fake news, actually? Like, why would you? Now, sometimes it's deliberately putting fake videos, deliberately putting untrue things. More often, it's kind of a selection bias. If some video comes along that validates your existing viewpoint, then you put it out there. You share it on social media without really scrutinizing the source, without checking all of the facts, without really doing that diligence. And if something comes along that contradicts your beliefs, then you're going to be like, okay, who's sponsoring that? Is that fake news? What website is that coming from? Does that data check out? and you're probably not going to share that. So a lot of the spread of fake news is unconscious, not deliberate. Either way, both of those things are happening because you're so sure that you're right. Whoever is putting that out there, unless they're just like a nihilistic troll, they're putting it out there because it's going to help our side. It's going to help convince people. So ultimately, fake news, what we're calling fake news here, is an inevitable symptom of us versus them mentality. And in order to become immune to it, we have to be aware of that us versus them polarity that lives within ourselves. Because then we are not so easily hooked by something that is suggesting, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you've been right all along. Yeah, you're on team good. And we can then exercise our critical thinking to look at it. But I don't always have time to do that. And I guess I just have to understand that I am biased, and that the narrative that I weave about the world and the information that I recruit to build that narrative is part of a state of being. It's not just an intellectual construct, because I notice that what I tend to, what I gravitate to changes depending on my emotional state, depending on how much time I've had my bare feet on the ground, how much time I've spent on a screen versus how much time I've spent with my hands in the dirt, listening to the birds, interacting with other beings. When I am more connected, then I am not so easily overtaken by despair. Because for me, it's not so much, is it the mainstream or the dissidents that are right? For me, it's more of, is the world in the grips of a horrifying, all-encompassing evil, or is consciousness rising, our frequency? I read a beautiful book by Arkan Lushwala, a Andean elder. I'm not sure if he's actually an elder, a man from Peru, who's saying, yeah, the frequency of all beings is rising right now. Orland Bishop says this as well, that new Earth energies and cosmic energies are being received by our blood, and elevating our consciousness. And I'm like, okay, that sounds nice, but dare I believe that? It seems so comforting. But what is comforting, just because it's comforting doesn't mean it's not true, And how do I gauge the truth of this? Yeah. It ultimately requires something from beyond the mind, because the mind can find the evidence and muster the logic to maintain any story. If you think that your views on COVID-19 or Donald Trump or police brutality or whatever are yours because you're smarter than other people, or more open-minded than other people, more logical than other people, you are deluded. There are extremely intelligent people smarter than you on the other side, smarter than me on the other side. The mind cannot orient us in this whirlwind of fake news and misinformation and disinformation. Only the body can. And that's why I'm very grateful that I have opportunities to ground into other sources of knowledge that help me navigate through this whirlwind.
That's a very profound point that you're making. I'd like, as we begin to close here, I'd like to probe that a little deeper, Charles. Because how we know what the truth is now has never been more important. And I remember an essay written by Carl Jung called After the Catastrophe, which he wrote in 1945 as he was looking back on the carnage of Nazi Germany. And in the end, he said, the reason why the Germans succumbed to the Nazis is because they cut themselves off from nature.
Mm.
When you cut yourself off from nature, said Jung, you become susceptible to every demagogue and warmonger that has a persuasive voice. And I've thought about that during the pandemic and in the onslaught of fake news and the Trump tweets and so forth and so on, which seems almost like a strategic assault on the confidence that all of us had at some point in our capacity to know what's real, that now is being systematically shattered.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no good that can come out of that. So the question of how we know what we know, how do we, given what you're saying about the increasing urbanization and, many people now don't know that milk comes from cows. All they know is it comes from Safeway, and that eggs and chickens and, the basic facts of nature are inaccessible to larger and larger numbers of people. We're in silos of self belief reinforced by others. And yet we're all, and this is the beauty of the pandemic, we're all in the same conversation. We all are experiencing a fissure of our normalcy, which is actually an extraordinary moment for some real truth telling. But we have to have the capacity to discern it, or it just blows right by us. And, as a public intellectual and author, part of your accountability in the public domain is truth telling, is reminding people of what they know, or at least advising them on how to know what they know. Just like the task of the poets and the artists is to reflect reality back to humanity in whatever way that aesthetic is mediated through their talents. Because unless we can ground ourselves in something, whether it's the earth, whether it's in community, whether it's in meditation, whether it's in our own spirituality, we've got to find some rock of Gibraltar. And so let's just, as we close for the next 5-10 minutes, let's reflect on that, on where truth is. How do we access it? Where are rocks of Gibraltar upon which we can tether belief?
Well, the first thing that comes to me, access to truth is a function of relationship. It's kind of the opposite of what Descartes said, where you go into a dark room and separate yourself from the world to have access to the pure truth. I think that when one does that, one gets lost in a maze of one's own projections. The truth, and I'm not saying here that truth is relative. When I say truth is a function of relationship, I'm not saying that it is relative and there's no absolute truth, or that we invent our own truth. What those critics are saying has a truth in it, which is that we do not decide what the truth is. That would be just another form of what I call the ascent of humanity to control the world. And this is where I differ with the postmodern view that says, oh, reality, truth, et cetera, that's just a story. That's just a narrative, a text. No. Well, yes, it's a story, but we're not the creators of that story. It's the other way around. The story is our creator. So truth is accessible through our relationships, through therefore listening and watching and participating in community, and in intimate relationship with nature. And then we can know things that don't depend just on the powers of our separate self, because we're part of a larger whole that can hold a much bigger truth than any of us can individually, left to our own devices. And that is also why, especially at this juncture, it's so important for us, i.e., and I apologize for including people in this us who are not maybe fully part of this us, us as in the modernized self. So if you've ever been to school or used money, been in a market economy, lived in a single family home, to some degree, you are part of this us. And the more that has defined your life, the more probably a part of this us you are. But anyway, just to say, it's especially important for us to access lost relationships. I've been calling them data points from outside of the modern view of the world, to bring new relationships or forgotten relationships, unacknowledged relationships, back into our matrix, because then we can know truths that are not available to us in the standard media environment, and supermarkets and cars and highways and single family homes and the great indoors. They're not available there. And if we are feeling as a society stuck, if we are feeling helpless to solve any of our real problems, we have to become curious. What is outside of the totality of legitimate information that we have systemically accepted? It's there. It's in the margins. There are other ways of knowing that have been maintained by other cultures, indigenous and traditional cultures, and by the wisdom lineages that have lay buried in our own culture. Those things have been marginal for a long time. In the same way that holistic health, herbs have been marginal. In the same way that the restorative justice practices that I spoke of have been marginal. In the same way that traditions carried by African Americans for many generations that have a through line back to Africa, back to Mother Africa itself, have been marginal. We have to bring those things together if we're going to get out of the maze forged from the materials of the discrete and separate self, exercising technological control over a world that is other. We have to reach outside of those building blocks. And that's why so many of us are curious about this new territory. And that's also why we're afraid of that new territory. And that fear manifests as the mainstream media and scientific establishment and academic establishment's rejection of it. Look up acupuncture on Wikipedia. The word pseudoscience and quackery will be in the first paragraph. I guarantee it. Same thing with chiropractic. Same thing with, homeopathy. Anything that is a little bit outside official reality. Well, and I'm not saying that everything outside of official reality is legitimate, but we have to become curious and not think that we know everything. If we knew everything, the world wouldn't be so messed up. It wouldn't be in such dire straits, would it? If we, modern society, modern civilization, if we had the answers, I mean, come on. Utopia is way overdue.
Yeah, good point. Utopia is way overdue, man. You know, I really appreciate what you're saying. You know, it reminded me of, you know, Socrates' great line that the unexamined life is not worth living, and your notion of curiosity, and his very deep belief that truth is discerned not by embracing answers, but by asking deeper and deeper questions. And I think that's why, you know, Plato honored dialogue so powerfully. It's not a matter of conventional wisdom or the teacher telling the student, thus is so, but it's how human beings come together in the spirit of unknowing, and in the question that sets up the relationship that you're talking about, because the unknowing and the questions inherently are relational, and therein is humility. I really want to thank you, Charles. Is there anything else you would like to add to our conversation? You know, as you look into the future, for example, what priorities would you set? If you were advising humanity at the moment, everybody says, okay, we want to do something. We can't do everything. What would be your sage advice to our species at this critical moment?
I would say that
our world, we have to move forward. What would be the priorities?
yeah, I'm wondering how like concrete to be with that answer. You know, I mean, I wrote a book on climate, you know, and I say the priorities are the organs and tissues of Gaia, regeneration, conservation. But I think maybe now the more important thing is, where do those priorities come from?
Mm-hmm.
They come from understanding our fundamental interconnectedness, even more than that, our interbeingness. And I would just add also that new life is born from the encounter of opposites, that this encounter can be a conflict, but it can also be a lovemaking. And that the greatest hope, the greatest potential, and by hope, I'm not talking fantasy. By hope, I'm talking a possibility that we recognize as
Mm-hmm.
true. That is that, and that there, that even if we don't know how to get there, we know that there is a path to get there. That's the most important message I would offer, is to find the part of yourself that recognizes it as true, that recognizes hope as a prevision of an authentic possibility. That recognition alone will guide you down beautiful pathways that you will recognize each step of, even if you can't plan out the path. I don't have a plan either. If anyone has a plan for utopia, be suspicious of them. Yeah, here's what we have to do. I don't know what we have to do, but with this understanding of interbeingness and the potential of the encounter of opposites, like where the most pain in the world is also where the most potent birthing can happen. Where it seems the most hopeless is actually the most powerful. And to walk into those places within and without, personally and globally, to walk into them with this solid knowledge that there is a way to get there, that a more beautiful world is possible. And just hold that knowing, because it's true. You can feel it. And there's all the doubts, there's all the skepticism, there's all the despair, but there's also this knowledge.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Hope is a prevision of possibilities you know to be true. That is a beautiful, beautiful statement, Charles. Thank you so much. And on that note, I want to thank you for the time. I am so glad we took the option of a deeper dialogue with you rather than 20 short minutes. And I hope you'll come back for another dialogue, maybe in a 2 or 3, 4 months' time as the world continues to unfold. You've enlightened all of us today, and I'm profoundly grateful. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Jim. It's my pleasure.
Now, everyone, we will turn back to Kim Rosen, and we will have just a final word of poetry, and then I'll give some announcements for tomorrow. Kim?
What an incredibly revelatory conversation. So grateful. I just want to say that one of my own personal yearnings and practices is to become more intimate with the mystery. And I feel that there's a way that you're saying that. And I also wrote about it in my blog on the Ubiverse, not sure how to say that, the Ubiverse website, which is called, the blog is called Of Meaning and Mystery. So I want to give a few poems. Always when I'm inspired, the poems that I am friends with come bubbling to the surface. So I could probably give about 1,000 right now, but I will give 3 short poems. And I will be playing a piece of music written by Gary Malkin called Into the Majesty. The first poem is just a quick quote that I couldn't help but think of Leonard Cohen, and everyone knows it, and we can all say it together. Oh no, I forgot the beginning of it. Ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And this is from Anna Akhmatova, who was writing in the midst of the Russian Revolution. She says, everything is plundered, betrayed, sold. Death's great black wing scrapes the air. Misery gnaws to the bone. Why then do we not despair? By day, from the surrounding woods, cherries blow summer into town. At night, the deep, transparent skies glitter with new galaxies. And the miraculous comes so close to the ruined, dirty houses. Something not known to anyone at all, but wild in our breast for centuries. And the miraculous comes so close to the ruined, dirty houses. Something not known to anyone at all, but wild in our breast for centuries. And a poem called Daydream by A.S.J. Tessamon. One day, people will touch and talk together easily. And loving, be natural as breathing and warm as sunlight. And people will untie themselves as string is unknotted, unfold and yawn and stretch and spread their fingers, unfurl, uncurl, like seaweed returned to the sea. And work will be simple and quiet, like a seagull flying, and play will be casual and swift as a seagull settling. And clocks will stop, and no one will wonder or care or notice. And people will smile without reason, even in winter, even in the rain. One day people will touch and talk together easily, and loving be natural as breathing and warm as sunlight. And people will untie themselves as string is unknotted, unfurl and stretch and spread their fingers, uncurl, unfold, like seaweed returned to the sea. And work will be simple and swift as a seagull flying, and play will be casual and quiet as a seagull settling. And the clocks will stop, and no one will care or wonder or notice. And people will smile for no reason, even in winter, even in the rain. It's 3 poems called Anthem by Leonard Cohen, Poem Without a Title by Anna Akhmatova, translated by Stanley Kunitz and Max Hayward, and a poem called Daydream by A.S.J. Tessamond. Deep gratitude for the opportunity to be with you. Thank you so much.
Kim, thank you. You've graced us. Smiling without reason, even in the winter, even in the rain. And I jotted down here that which has been wild in our breasts for centuries, from Akhmatova. That wildness is where we know what we know. And that's the basis of our hope, as Charles indicated and as Kim just indicated. So I want to really thank Kim. I hope that she'll be back to grace us with more poetry as we move forward. I want to now turn our attention to the next 10 days. Given what Charles shared today, just honoring the complexity of our world. We're in a riddle within a mystery, within an enigma, as Churchill said about the Russians about 75 years ago. How do we know what the truth is? Well, one of the truths that we do know is that climate change is spinning out of control. Whatever the deniers say, that's what's true. It's also true that authoritarian regimes are rising up all over. That's what's true. It's also true, as Charles and Kim just shared with us, that wild runs the spirit in the human breast, and hope springs eternal in the winter and in the rain. And we all smile for no reason. and that there are thousands, millions, tens of millions of people working every day for a better world. Every human being is motivated by a different passion. Every conceivable issue is being addressed by dozens or hundreds or thousands of NGOs. People of goodwill are working in our governments and major international institutions. And yet the world situation continues to spin out of control. So over the next 10 days, we're going to be delving into how, given the complexity, and that's one reason why we asked Charles Eisenstein to speak today. We need to honor the complexity. Christ is crucified and the fairies dance. There's light and shadow dimensions whirling all around us. There's forces and powers and principalities competing for the human soul. And things are getting better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster, and we're headed into one big, huge bang. So how do we, my friends, now, at this time, come together in a way that we can actually make a difference in the shape of the post-pandemic world? The authoritarian regimes know what they want. We know what we want. A world of sustainability, abundance, health, safety, creativity, community. How do we create it? The pandemic has created a crack in our normalcy. Charles was absolutely right. And as Leonard Cohen says, that's how the light comes through. There's a lot of light coming through right now. How do we seize it? That's what we're going to be talking about. We're not coming into Humanity Rising with any answers. And I appreciated thereby the humility of Charles. He wasn't coming in with any answers either. That's part of what the pandemic has destroyed. So for the next 10 days, we're going to live the question. How do we enhance our strategic effectiveness so that we can catalyze behavioral change, positive behavioral change at scale globally? What would that look like? And how do we make it happen? Because we have to. The governments aren't going to solve this. The companies aren't going to solve this. Humanity rising up together in the spirit of radical collaboration. That's what it's going to take. How do we do that? So we'll see you tomorrow, same time, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. Central European time, and every day, 7 days a week for as long as the pandemic lasts, really taking counsel together as to how we actually make a difference in creating a just and sustainable post-pandemic world. Thank you, everyone.